Okay, so let's talk about enthymemes. What is an enthymeme? Well, basically, it's an argument that's either missing a premise or a conclusion. So there is a hidden premise or conclusion. Usually it's implied. And this is going to be really common in the real world because often it seems like there might be something that just doesn't need to be stated. The connection between a premise and a conclusion might seem clear, and so there's a hidden premise, or the conclusion that follows from two premises might seem clear, and so it's not stated explicitly. So, what we can do is make those missing premises or conclusions explicit in order to more clearly see the argument structure. So, let's look at this example. First, what's the conclusion? Here, look at the indicator word because indicating premise. So the conclusion here is some police chiefs undermine the even-handed enforcement of the law. The conclusion is anyone who fixes parking tickets does that, i.e. undermines the even-handed enforcement of the law. So what are we missing? Well, looks like we're missing the premise that connects our premise to anyone who fixes parking tickets undermines the even-handed enforcement of the law to the conclusion that some police chiefs undermine the even-handed enforcement of the law, right? So let's draw out what the premise and conclusion are. So then we'll be better able to see what's the bridging premise that we're missing, because we're missing something that connects that premise to that conclusion. You might be able to already see it, but I'm going to go slowly and reason my way through what it must be based on the structure of our premise and our conclusion here. So I've written out, and feel free to pause if you want to take a second to think through what you think the missing premise is. I'll write out what premise and conclusion that are explicitly stated are. And so we can see that the minor term is police chiefs, the major term, people who undermine the even-handed enforcement of the law. The minor term isn't found in the premise, so we're going to need that minor term in the premise. And the middle term, people who fix parking tickets, is also going to need to be there. So we're going to say some police chiefs are people who fix parking tickets, right? So if you can kind of think of this in ordinary language, if I were to say this original argument, well, it might be implicit, it might be implied, but I haven't directly stated that police chiefs fix parking tickets. And we don't need it to be all, it just needs to be some. So let's use this argument to practice some of our concepts from this chapter. We've got an A, an I, and an I, our minor term and our major term, and our middle term. So we can see that our middle term is diagonal, top to bottom. So what does that mean? That means we are figure 1. So this is an A, I, 1 argument form. Is this a valid argument form? Well, let's first check the rules. Remember, universal distributes subject, negative distributes predicate. So let's see which terms are distributed here. We don't have any negative. We have one universal, so that subject is going to be distributed. So that's the middle term, so that's good. Middle term distributed in at least one premise. Nothing's distributed in the conclusion, which means we don't need to worry about that. We have an affirmative. We have a particular. So it doesn't look like we're breaking any rules. Let's double check that using Venn diagrams. All right, so as always, let's put our minor term on the left, major term on the right, and our middle term up top. And then we're going to fill in, remember, always if there's a universal premise, always fill that in first. So all people who fix parking tickets are people who undermine the even-handed enforcement of the law. All middle are major. So we're going to shade any middle that's not a major here. So this whole middle region that's not in the major region is going to be shaded due to premise 1. And then premise 2, some police chiefs are people who fix parking tickets. This is a particular claim, so we're going to get an X instead of shading. Some minor are middle. So that means that little region that contains the intersection of minor and middle, there's got to be something in there. So then the conclusion does follow that some police chiefs are people who undermine the even-handed enforcement of the law. So this argument is valid. And that's just one example that we can use to show enthymemes, which are arguments missing a conclusion or a premise. We want to fill in the missing conclusion or premise, and we also use this to show examples of other concepts we've learned in this chapter.